Kieran, thank you for the kind introduction, and some of your notes were very important for what I'll be speaking about today. And thank you, Alan, for the opportunity to be here. It's a great pleasure to be back in Ireland. And I should open up by saying that if I were not here in Ireland speaking, I would be somewhere else speaking about Ireland. And that's an important point because there are many examples in Ireland that I use as best practices and centers of excellence. So I'm a great promoter and also ambassador for this country. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I would open up by saying that unfortunately the slides I have today, although they're very beautiful on my Macintosh, they haven't really transferred very well to the screen. So I'm very happy to give my presentation to CITA to publish on their website or after the conference. And there's also a publication which is available online, which I wrote for the Australian government, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. And the context or the platform from which many of the ideas or contributions I'll make today come from, let's say, 3 different ways in which I function in the world of architecture. And I think first and foremost, and probably the most humbling and instructive, is, of course, as an educator and teaching for nearly 25 years in a professional school. I teach at the very beginning, design studio for the students who first come in, and I teach at the end, well, I thought was the end, which is professional practice and ethics, just before the students leave to go into their careers. And I say I thought that was the end when I first started because it was the end of the curriculum. But when I imagined that that was the beginning of the next 50 or 60 years of their efforts, architecture being a very late maturing and lifelong learning profession, that changed everything. And so I'm always thinking about where they're going to be in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. Otherwise, what was the value of the education they gave us, that we gave them, if it wasn't preparing them for the future? So we always built on tradition, had them embrace challenges, but expect change. The other role I play is as a consultant, mostly to other academic institutions and to professional organizations in particular, to structure the entire path from education into the internship period and then into lifelong learning in organizations. And that also has to do with practices in industry, but how do you exchange knowledge? I'm really concerned about that. We're talking about building information modeling today. We have data, we have information, we have knowledge, we have education, and ultimately culture. And then within that pathway, and here's another example of when I use Ireland, is in teaching professional practice and ethics. We've developed a case studies program throughout the United States as a collaboration with the American Institute of Architects and the large firms throughout the country. That was very much inspired by what is done in Ireland. We use them as a model. Also, the Office of Public Works program for interns features very prominently, and I'm mentioning that with some degree of detail because we try to make architecture education for the industry look much more like medicine, which is a matter of life and death, and law, which is part of the public record that gets shared and builds the knowledge base for the profession. So in that consulting role, it's really important to look at disciplines outside of architecture. And then lastly, and I'll wrap up this introduction, I'm going to speak about my advising role to the Australian government. And I think that's important in understanding your decision about BIM, not today, but in 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years. So I had the privilege of being invited by the Premier and Cabinet of the Australian government, and those are politicians, not the, let's say we'll call them elected officials, and not the other side of government, to advise on well, they invited me to advise on sustainable buildings, but I'll get to that in a moment. It was a program called Thinkers in Residence, where they invited a global expert to come and advise the government, and I was the first architect to be invited to do that. And I think very clever and very wise program. They'd had scientists and filmmakers, but the important point was here that they invited me to look at sustainable buildings. And I looked at some of the challenges that they were facing and some of the issues that were beyond the field of architecture. And I said, well, would you mind if we looked a little broader? And I asked them if I could write my own brief. And so I said, let's look at the value of design and the impact of the built environment on the quality of life. Whoa. So really cracked it open for several reasons, not the least of which is if you talk to politicians about design or about architecture, you very quickly lose their interest, and their main concerns for the quality of life are much broader. So you talk about infrastructure, you talk about health, you talk about education. So that kind of brief allowed architecture and the building industry to have a much broader impact. So they adopted that, and over a 4-month period, I worked with 15 partners, some professional organizations, some academic institutions, people in government, and obviously industry. So I'm going to talk about some of the strategies that I developed for the government, but put that in the context of making a decision about how to intelligently invest in BIM. It's important to know in which context and what the goal is. I have the great privilege of following a number of speakers who are real giants in the industry, so I'm going to provide quite a bigger view and look into the long term. So these are terms that have come up throughout the conference: quality, value, innovation. Certainly the role of BIM in delivering those things. David spoke extensively about outcomes yesterday, but in a BIM environment or any technological environment, what's the relationship? And ultimately, we're trying to deliver value, quality, and innovation. So if we imagine what the profession looks like, where we're delivering students, we're trying to imagine a future where the industry delivers outstanding quality that's responsive and sustainable, where all communications throughout the process are clear, concise, open, transparent, and trusting, where decisions and processes are performance-driven and value-based, where all stakeholders are involved from the initiation of the project, where outcomes are inspired and visionary. It would be very difficult to argue against that as a goal, but what is the role, or how do you position BIM to get you to that point, or collectively for all of us to get to that point? So if we imagine a future where we're looking at the relationship between design, development, and planning, or the construction industry, the development industry, and planning, oftentimes regulation, who's receiving the rewards, who's taking the risk, who's assuming responsibility, and what are the procurement structures, the policies, and the politics that go around delivering that collectively. And I'm going to read this quote and then tell you who said it. As in all things, what is needed here is leadership, and there's only ever 2 ingredients in that: imagination and courage. Because it's imagination that sketches the broader perspectives, providing patterns and frameworks to encompass myriad elements that would otherwise remain unwoven. That's the Prime Minister of Australia, not the current one, but Paul Keating, who was a great fan of architecture and urban design, and he understood that it's always about the relationship between things that makes the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And so I took the occasion, because I was so inspired that Brian Hayes came to open the conference yesterday, so I quoted him, so he's going to be on record. We care about sustainability. He said that we care about sustainability, and we're seeking a whole-of-life approach. Wonderful opportunity, and I hope we can hold him to that. Insofar as I will define what intelligent investment is, and Fyneth made the point that, you know, politicians, if we don't give them the means to make better decisions, well, then we're part of the problem. I really appreciated that comment. So if, and I apologize that the text here is very small, but for us to get to that imagined world and to be leaders, there has to be a really distinct cultural shift. But I would like to imagine that Ireland can be a global expert, and I truly believe that, and a leader of the AEC industry, where BIM positions design, development, and planning in a much different way. I also was very inspired yesterday by a quote from Martin McGrath, who said, "Irish design and construction can lead the way." I fully believe that. There are elements and ingredients in the Irish context that are totally unique, size being one that's very critical. Collaboration here is vital. And you're small enough and nimble enough, but with a really distinguished history, that can happen. But there needs to be a cultural shift from things that are market-driven, which is very much a push process, to things that are human-centered, which is a very pull process. Things that are homogeneous and hierarchical to things that are diverse and lateral thinking. That's something I think BIM does very well, is that it promotes lateral thinking between disciplines. Things that are linear to things that are cyclical, but moreover, things that are first cost-based to things that are mutually beneficial and life cycle value. Cost to value is the major shift that needs to happen for this to succeed. From quantity to quality, no doubt. BIM is still quite quantitative in its parametric configuration. How do we overlay or embed the qualitative outcomes? I think that's probably my primary message today, and that's a hopeful destination. And from individual control and power to things that are collaboratively influenced. So what is intelligent investment? And I think Ireland's going to understand this probably best, is that the current paradigm under which most of the world operates and has learned the hard way is that you have the development industry that was, fundamentally concerned with economics, and then it goes to the planning regulation, who's fundamentally interested in the environmental, but not, let's say, from a spatial perspective, and then it goes to the design and construction industry, who's, I hope, and generally concerned about the social aspects or how people are actually going to use it. But if you see that cone, it's very reductive, and the design world gets what's left over. But if we reverse that and we looked at an integrated design process, and here's where BIM is very important, is that if we put design up front, and that's where the creativity and innovation is harnessed, and then it goes to planning, which is about building communities, rather and only the stifling of innovation through regulation. And then it goes to the development community, who tries to build incentives. This is a completely different model where economics and environment and the social dimension are not separated, but they're running in parallel streams. So the intelligent investment of BIM is, how is it measuring those things simultaneously and helping us to get better decisions and advising governments to get the best value for money? So the first strategy, and this is a little bit adapted from Australia, is very obvious: collaborative construction. But what does that mean? And when you have to explain it to a non-industry audience, the relationship between ecological, sustainable design, integrated project delivery, and building information modeling, and the relationship between clients, or those we serve, design professionals, and contractors. So simple enough, but sometimes it's important to map who are the players and who needs to talk to each other in order to structure the information, but particularly the knowledge. So the model of that is not AEC, but A plus E plus C, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The role of architecture in this equation, the role of engineering, and the role of construction, where architecture establishes certain principles that are developed through engineering and technological solutions, and then construction looks at the fabrication or the assembly. The configuration of these parts, why would we do this? Well, obviously, and some of the gains for using BIM, and this came up in BIM to Win yesterday, is reduce conflicts, construction time, cost, errors, loss of information, omissions, or waste, and that's a reason you should use it, and that those are the outcomes you want to expect. And it increases communication, efficiency, innovation and opportunity, precision, productivity, predictability, and prototyping. Now, Australia was at a point in 2010 where they were also considering national-wide adoption. So you have to articulate in basic terms what are the gains and what are the pains and what are the increases and what are the reductions. But that's still fairly abstract until you put it into a context. So using an exhibit from Australia's Alliance in Contracting, you have to get down to let's say, the details to make these kind of, I wouldn't call them theoretical arguments, but sort of constructs. The Alliance in Contracting in Australia is really quite advanced, and it has some really positive attributes, and it supports BIM-related, or at least collaborative construction work very well. But one of the things that they were trying to get over is that most of the reward model was based on the economics, and that can often produce a conflict of interest, particularly for the architect. So what they're trying to do now is broaden that to the quadruple bottom line, is that it has social rewards and risks and responsibilities, but also environmental responsibilities, risks, and rewards. But then ultimately, how is something governed? So the contracts are now beginning to expand that it's not just about money and cost, but it's about overall value. So those alliancing contracts really fundamentally, and not necessarily from a legal perspective, try to focus on sustainability, value, integration, and performance. The second strategy, and I'm sorry this is very small, environmental leadership, or if Greg were here, we might call this leadership, is infrastructure, of course, is something that the government understands very well. I don't need to tell you that governments, by their nature, are very siloed, both in their agencies and tiers of government. City doesn't speak to state, doesn't speak to federal. Infrastructure doesn't speak to health, to justice. They're very siloed. So, but infrastructure is something that, because it allows people to play out their lives in real time, they sort of understood that the environment, of course, in lean terms, you're looking at water, waste, and energy, to name a few, but those are in service to people, buildings and infrastructure, space and transport. So how does BIM sort of not be perceived as a static model, but help to understand that design works in a world of flows? And at the center, which you can't see, are economies and ecologies. So every one of these elements is part of an ecosystem, but where can the data information in any kind of modeling environment help us to find those connections? Again, a little bit small, but the model for this kind of leadership is understanding that there is an integration of systems. You know that very well from a building environment, particularly with the engineering disciplines, interfacing with the architectural disciplines. So you have a integration of systems, but you also have ecologies of use and economies of scale. I think this is also something that we're seeing in a BIM environment. There's obviously a lot of concentration on urban design. How are those models scalable to other environments, transferable and scalable from everything from an interior or a streetscape to a building, to a region, to a landscape? And how are they interfacing with other software packages to deliver really good outcomes. So again, what I was offering to the government is structuring a way of thinking. If I had actually consulted on sustainable buildings, I would have come and gone, and they might have had a few better buildings, but they can get that knowledge elsewhere. What it was about was structuring a different way of thinking and structuring a different way of working and talking to each other. What this shows is the strategic plan of South Australia up on the left, but the flows of information in solving any problem which have to do with ideas and values, information, energy, capital, people and services. And I'm just giving one example of an agency that I think is doing this very well, the Ecological Sequestration Trust in the UK. It's actually a charity headed by Peter Head, who is formerly from Europe. And they're working now worldwide in China and Africa and also in the UK, building a model that is quite sensitive to something very important, agent activities, in other words, people. But they're modeling whole environments where they're offering a decision-making dashboard or environment for people who are going to use it, but also politicians. So Peter is pioneering this on his own in the last 3 years, and I think he's developed a really positive model. I think the same thing is happening in Singapore. The Singapore government hired the ETH, which is one of the leading universities in the world, from Zurich to create the same thing, but they're doing it with millions of dollars and 140 people. And Peter's heading up the Ecological Sequestration Trust. But I also used it as an example because it's a charity nonprofit organization. The third is industry innovation. This will be much more familiar, but the relationship between, and this is promoting the value of design in many ways, the relationship between design usability, business viability, and engineering feasibility. Processes, environments, and systems, how does it interface with markets, technology, and production? People in government understand this world much better. And I think this is hugely important for the future of our industry, is how does building information modeling lead to manufactured assemblies for mass customization? David showed a really impressive model, jaw-dropping model yesterday of the 15-story building in China, 15 stories, 30 days. And that's only possible because a modeling environment allowed industrial designers, engineers, quantity surveyors, architects to come together under a model to digitally fabricate a real kit of parts. This is not modular building, but we should and we want to expect to be able to order our environments as we would in some ways a car, with all the special luxuries or particular performance criteria that are suitable to a cultural environment, but also a physical environment. And my example is not nearly so impressive, except that this was a prototype of a kit of parts, and it's really beautiful. This went up in 15 days, so again, not as impressive, but it is beautifully detailed, digitally fabricated, zero energy, and it can come down in 15 days. We didn't get to that part yesterday, but what is our ability to take these things apart, move them to another environment, and I think the need for really good housing globally is crucial. So I can't advocate for this more passionately. Probably close to my territory is a recommendation of moving to what we call practice-based use-inspired research. Research hasn't received much discussion so far, although the Forfas report which I've looked at in terms of what the research recommendations are, is quite promising, particularly the target for research on smart cities. But what I will say is that traditional research environments have been, again, a very small slide, and I'll make a very quick lesson on research. What we have is basic research, which happens in a university, which is incredibly important, but takes a long time to have impact on the market. It's something that we want to foster. In the last, at least generation, there's a move to applied research, sort of looking at real problems that, where researchers, again, in research institutions or academic environments, will look at real problems and try to bridge that gap. But what we're looking at now is what's called practice-based use-inspired research. We're putting the research into the practice. Because, in fact, architects and engineers do research all the time, but it's often project-based or practice-based, but it's never shared in the profession. So we're trying to set up models now, recognizing the value of that work and the need to create a much more evidence-based profession where we can provide answers that are backed up by real research. It's really unfortunate that this slide, I'm just going to have to tell a quick story. But I mentioned earlier about case studies. This is a phenomenal set of case studies which were co-sponsored by the US government, by the American Institute of Architects, and written by the University of Minnesota. They're IPD, integrated project delivery case studies, and there's a component, they look at legal strategies, management strategies, and social strategies, as well as technology. So they're telling the entire story of the building, and the last slice is BIM. So they look at BIM in the context of an entire project, and what you'll find is there was often a decision not to use BIM, how much it was used, when it was successful, and I think these are really important. So this is an interactive series of case studies on the AIA website, which I think are leading to a really good platform for knowledge sharing. On the same note, we've just launched a new master's degree, not Carnegie Mellon, but I was consulting to the University of Minnesota, which is called a master's in research-based practices, and so the students are working 30 hours a week in an architectural office paired with a faculty mentor who's a researcher, oftentimes a practitioner, and a mentor in the office, and they're conducting research for the office while gaining their internship credit and teaching the office how to build a research environment. So they get academic credit, they get internship credit, but you see the firms form a consortium where they choose the kind of research that they need to have done, very typical very cutting-edge research projects, and then at the end of the semester they share the knowledge amongst the firms. So now we're trying to create a tide that floats all boats. So I think this is really the future of education, and in fact, in some ways, a model that was very inspired by the Irish context. Fifth strategy, quality commitment, and this gets right down to how to work between industry, government, academic institutions, and professional organizations. The relationship between education, research, and practice to develop policies that are performance-driven. Procurement, of course, is a discussion in any country. How do you create procurement models that lead to much, much better outcomes? And most contracts and governments are risk-aversive, but we're trying to look at procurement models that are also balanced in terms of rewards and responsibilities. So the model for that, and if Phil Bernstein, a colleague of mine, some of you may know, Vice President of Autodesk, if he were to draw this diagram a few years ago, this is an aspirational model for BIM, he would show this as a sawtooth, where every part of the process you gain momentum and then you lose information and it goes to the next stage. So the aspiration is not only for BIM to help us create a smooth curve, but also that the information and the expertise that firms or practices are gaining would help to shift to a procurement model that is more a qualification-based selection. And an exhibit of that, and I'm running out of time here, of measurements is, I think a very good example is the Committee on the Environment Top 10. How do they measure quality? Of course, Committee on the Environment is a sustainability-related agency, but they measure their awards program according to sustainable design intent, long life, loose fit, collective wisdom, and feedback loops. It's not just about the technology, it's about the entire environment of decision making. I'll come back to this list on the left, but to conclude with 3 last slides, if we were to imagine the role of BIM and the decision to use BIM and to make BIM an intelligent investment, it's fundamentally predicated on making it user-centered. That's a goal. If BIM isn't delivering information or helping us to construct knowledge that serves our clients, owners, public society, user occupants, that's fundamentally what we're doing in this industry, is ultimately getting to that. But it's going to require the collaboration of all these stakeholders in the process from the very beginning. The other is, our imagined future is that we're expertise driven, that we understand what it is we do, particularly as in the design world. What is integrated design? We work in very particular ways with very particular characteristics, processes, and tools. We shouldn't become a slave to BIM. It should be a mechanism that helps us to increase our value. There's an article coming out by Phil Bernstein in the Yale Journal in the spring, and it's quite riveting. I can't share it because I promised not to, but the title is Money, Value, Buildings, Architects. And there's been references to it today, but until architects tie their fees to the value, that they're not a service, but in fact the value that they deliver, it will be very difficult to change the equation. So I encourage you to read that, but if we were to tie our value or our worth to outcomes that are performance driven, it would be very different, and the impact that we can deliver in economic, environmental, and social terms. And then finally, imagined future is quality measured. One of the, and I'll end where I started about being an ambassador for Ireland, is that I often refer to your government policy on architecture. It's a really extremely well-conceived and well-structured document that is also monitored. In that, the kind of measures that we should aspire to in using BIM or any other tool or environment are ones that can be discussed with all stakeholders. It would be hard to argue that we don't want any of these attributes for anything from a product to an entire landscape, that it would be authentic, convenient, reliable, flexible, transformational. So I think that the policy is a really good platform and environment to measure the use of BIM to achieve these kinds of results. Thank you very much.